What if Ardeen Taylor was a horror punk pioneer? Find out on this week's spooky What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name's Morgan Brown, and for the past few months I've been making a series of videos that I call What If videos. Each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which a different set of circumstances or a decision that someone made caused that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand to make that alternative universe version come to life. For this week's song, going with October's spooky Halloween theme, I went for Ardeen Taylor's Northern Soul classic, There's a Ghost in My House, and I decided to try and turn that into a horror punk song. So if you haven't had a chance to have a listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Where our love used to be, all the shadows of the past I see, time can see no erase, the vision of your smiling face, those times I knew I had your view, there's a ghost in my house, I can't hide. So Ardeen Taylor is kind of a bit of a hidden figure in popular music, really. He was a really interesting guy and definitely involved in quite a lot of cool music over the course of many years. Apparently started out playing country music, but by the 60s became involved in Motown records, and There's a Ghost in My House, the song that I did this week, is actually one of the singles that he released as a performer with Motown records. There were a couple really good songs. Did a lot of great work as a songwriter and producer with the label. So co-writing with Holland Dozier and Holland, the legendary songwriting team there. They co-wrote There's a Ghost in My House, but he also wrote hits for the Four Tops and the Temptations and a few others with them. Then when they moved on from Motown to start Invictus Records, he joined the production and songwriting team that took over handling Diana Ross and the Supremes. So had a hand in the likes of Love Child and I'm Living in Shame. So some really heavy hitting stuff. And then towards the end of the 60s, start of the 70s, Motown starts the Rare Earth label. It's a sort of spin-off label that focuses on rock and prog kind of acts, generally the white acts who've been signed to the label. And at that point, Ardeen moves back into performance a bit more. It's in 1970 that he actually has his biggest US hit, which was Indiana Wants Me. And his material around that time, it's moved away from soul. It's a bit more in the kind of easygoing, early 70s singer-songwriter-y vein. Interestingly, There's a Ghost in My House, although I think for people in the UK particularly, it's his best remembered song, wasn't hit in the States at all. It pretty much fell under the radar all around when it came out in 1967. It's only really as a result of the Northern Soul scene in the UK that There's a Ghost in My House, along with a lot of other kind of soul classics, was rediscovered. So it then became a hit in the UK, but completely failed to land in the US altogether. So he's a guy who's had a lot of behind the scenes influence in music, but has never really particularly got his due. Partly, although he's a great singer, not a particularly charismatic performer. The few little bits of footage I've managed to find of him doesn't really have star power. Yeah, an underrated guy, it's definitely fair to say. So my thought for this week was, it kind of gets to the mid-70s, Rare Earth Records has folded, and old Ardeen is kind of a bit out of sorts. He's not really involved in anything anymore. Doesn't really know what he's doing with himself. But at this point, he happens to witness the Ramones for the first time. And obviously, never heard any music quite like this, the sort of blend of kind of classic pop with this raucous, driving rock power. And he's also particularly taken by the lyrics of a couple of songs, namely Chainsaw and I Don't Want to Go Down to the Basement. Really likes the way they've made humorous use of these kind of horror movie tropes in the lyrics. Decides to look into this new developing scene more. Discovers the Cramps, who are combining classic rockabilly and garage sounds with more sort of ghoulish B-movie imagery, and the Damned, who make this deafening garage racket but have a lead singer who looks like a vampire, and thinks, maybe I could combine all these elements together and make something that's my own niche within this new movement and launch my comeback that way. So he decides, well, I've got a song in the catalogue which kind of fell under the radar when I first released it. It's already a bit spooky, so how about if I take There's a Ghost to my house and remake it into this new horror punk mold that I'm envisaging. So in my alternative universe scenario, he does this, goes out on tour, but generally rejected by punk audiences who see him as a member of the old guard who needs to be cleared out of the way, and returns dejected and leaves it all behind. But in the course of his ill-fated horror punk tour, he plays in Lodi, New Jersey, and is seen by a young Glenn Danzig and Jerry Only, who are inspired to start their own band following in his footsteps. So that was kind of the story I envisaged for this track. So yeah, horror punk is an interesting little subgenre. You can certainly trace it back at least to the Ramones, who used imagery from horror movies and B-movies in their songs with this kind of ghoulish sense of humor, and the Cramps, who did the same with that 50s influence as well. The Damned, as I say, also an important influence. And then horror's a thing that's just fascinated a lot of people in different areas of punk ever since, really. So, I mean, you get things like the whole death rock movement springing up. Bands like 45 Grave, I guess, would fit into that, Christian Death. But even bands in like the anarcho-punk genre, notably Rudimentary Peni, who were always pretty bleak and dark, had an album called Cacophony, which is very much concerned with horror, being a concept album about the life and work of H.P. Lovecraft. In later years, you get bands like the Groovy Ghoulies, who kind of sound like a sunshiny kind of pop punk band, but at the same time, so many of their songs reference things like vampires and classic horror movie monsters, The Blob, Godzilla, that kind of thing. Or even in the crossover thrash genre, I mean, thrash metal, I guess, quite often invoked horror movie imagery anyway, but I'm thinking particularly of Send More Paramedics, who were a crossover thrash band who appeared as zombies and sang about zombie-related topics as well. So punk on many levels has been infused with horror imagery since its inception, really. But I guess if we're talking about horror punk, you've got to go back to the Misfits, which is the reason why I've got this ridiculous hairdo today. So the Misfits, generally considered to be the founders of horror punk, it's not really up for debate. Formed in Lodi, New Jersey in 1977, and it just got this great sound, kind of a mixture of the Ramones, bits of kind of classic pop and rock and roll, really lo-fi, raw, garagey attack as well. And then these lyrics that are concerned with ghoulish stuff from B-movies and trashy Hollywood scandal and generally dark and nasty stuff. For a band that recorded a lot of material, they only released 2 proper albums during their lifetime. Weirdly for me, their best 2 albums worth of material were never released as albums while they were an active band. That being the Static Age session, which was kind of split up into a bunch of singles and only emerged as a CD years and years later. And then 12 Hits from Hell, which again was mined for singles but never actually came out at all. It was meant to be finally released after the band had split up, but was nixed at the last minute. So if you do have a copy of that, it's a cheeky bootleg like the one I've got. But yeah, it took them a long time to get an album out. When it finally did emerge, they released Walk Among Us. I prefer 12 Hits from Hell slightly, but I think part of the issue with that was they were looking to phase out Bobby Steele and bring in Jerry Only's brother Doyle on guitar. So by Walk Among Us, Doyle's in on guitar. They've got the full Misfits image that everyone knows now, and that's kind of the definitive Misfits record for a lot of folk. Great tunes on there. It's still got that kind of bubblegum pop aspect, but it's rowdy and nasty as well. Really silly, really spooky. And then by the next album, Earth AD / Wolf's Blood, there's a massive Motorhead and Discharge influences come in, so all of a sudden the bubblegum melodies are kind of out the window and it's full on heads down thrash. For me, it's not quite as satisfying, but it's still a great record and undeniably massively influential. I mean, you can absolutely hear Metallica coming straight out of that record, so one of the founding documents of thrash metal there as well. But then by the time they're recording that, they're already falling apart, so the band splits up. Glenn Danzig goes on to form Samhain, another great horror punk band, which eventually morphs into Danzig. Also a great band, not really anything you could call punk anymore. They're more of a doomy blues metal kind of band, but more enjoyable than that sounds from that description. In their wake, other people do take up this mantle, so Bobby Steele, the second guitarist of the Misfits, starts the Undead, who lead the charge of other bands taking up the horror punk thing. And then it's been kind of an ongoing thing ever since. Bands like Creeper, AFI, some really notable and interesting ones along the way. Balzac over in Japan are pretty fascinating, and one of the few bands who have almost a stronger merch game as the Misfits themselves. And I should definitely mention my old pals Zombina and the Skeletons, who I remember seeing them live when they were still in school, but 20 odd years later they're back after a hiatus, and they do some absolutely great horror punk, very much on the poppier end of things. A lot of Rizillo's influence, who are another band who were quite influential in the blending of punk with B-movie imagery as well. But yeah, if you've not heard Zombie and the Skeletons, definitely go and check them out. Really cool. You'll note I've not really mentioned the later era of the Misfits, post Glenn Danzig. Not everyone's going to agree with it. I just don't consider that to be the Misfits at all. Basically, if you don't know, some years after the Misfits broke up, Jerry Only and Doyle began a Christian metal band called Christ the Conqueror with a K. I guess they'd found Jesus and wanted to do something to make up for all the evil they'd put out into the world with the Misfits. So they made this metal record. I'd listen to it on YouTube. Some people seem to love it. I think it's pretty horrible, just clunky, awkward metal with Christian lyrics. But after doing that for a little while, those two and the drummer get a new singer, Michael Graves, mainly noted as being a right-wing dipshit, but they get him in and then start their own lineup of the Misfits. Some people love it. To me, it doesn't sound remotely like the Misfits. Glenn Danzig wrote all those songs. They were great songs. Without him, it's just not right. But they churned out a few albums. After Michael Graves leaves, Jerry Only takes over on vocals. They end up with Des Cadena from Black Flag coming on guitar. And Des is really cool, but it's not the Misfits. They end up with Marky Ramone coming on drums. But I saw him do a spoken word show, and even he admitted it wasn't the Misfits. So yeah, not for me. But in recent years, Glenn and Jerry and Doyle have actually got back together to be the Misfits again, with Dave Lombardo from Slayer on drums, and people seem to have a good time when they go and see those shows. So that's cool. But yeah, for me, the Misfits stopped with Earth AD. In terms of what I wanted to do with There's a Ghost in My House, it was obviously that Misfits template I was going for. So punk rock that's poppy but really raw and garagey. So the first thing obviously I always do with these things, I take the original vocal and sync it up to the grid on GarageBand. Bit difficult to do because the tempo of the original record fluctuates quite a bit, and there aren't many useful edit points in There's a Ghost in My House because there are a lot of backing vocals, but I just about got it there. I decided that I wanted to mimic a bit of the structure of the old Misfits song Mummy Can I Go Out and Kill Tonight, which starts with a slower brooding intro and then bursts into a high energy main section. So the spoken word intro to There's a Ghost in My House comes in over this mid-tempo kind of backing, and then when we get into the song proper, there's a little kind of snare count off and then it rockets away. So I'll program some drums on. Normally what I do with GarageBand drums, I kind of play the drums in on my MIDI keyboard and then go through tidying everything up and making sure everything's a lot more in time than it was when I played it in. But with this, I did very little tidying up because I just wanted to get that raw, loose, flying by the seat of the pants feel that you get with those early Misfits records. In fact, I did very little tidying up and editing with any of the tracks on this. I'll pop the drums on, some bass with a really gnarly, growly tone, 3 guitar tracks, all with kind of really blown out distortion. The guitar I used for it was this one. This is my original, my first ever electric guitar. It's a 1989, I think, Sun Mustang. Fender's mega budget line of guitars that used to be made in India. Actually quite a nice guitar. I think these were better than the Squiers in those days. The only thing that I didn't like about it was the pickups were a bit quiet, so I put these cheapo, no-name Hot Rails humbuckers in, and then it became a lot less subtle, but perfect for the sort of blown-out sounds I was going for on this recording. So 2 rhythm guitars, panned left and right, and then another one with a fuzz tone playing the fuzz guitar riff from the original record. I also decided to double that fuzz riff with some whoa backing vocals because that's a big Misfits trademark. If you think of songs like Astro Zombies, I don't like to sing in this flat because the walls are pretty thin and I do disturb my neighbours quite often, but I just recorded one set of them and then duplicated it so I didn't have to bother them too much. Whoa, 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 whoa. And then, just for a bit of spooky ambience, I added some sound effects to the start and end of the track. So I found a synth patch that just basically makes a kind of synthesized howling wind noise and blended that with literally just a recording of me going, woo, which I fed through all kinds of effects until it sounded spooky. And then basically just drove everything into the red. So the whole thing is edging into distortion to mimic that hastily recorded on the tape, blown out Misfit sound. I think it came out sounding pretty solid. And then for a video, normally obviously I'd get some performance footage of the original singer and then mix it in with other things. Unfortunately, as far as I can gather, there's literally no footage of Ardeen Taylor performing There's a Ghost in My House anywhere. The only footage I could find was him doing Indiana Wants Me. So instead of using performance, I basically found a bunch of cool clips from fun things to do with ghosts. So the Three Stooges and Abbott and Costello, Casper the Friendly Ghost, just edited those together. And then I've got Ardeen's face just popping up in the background as a bit of a ghostly background presence, which I guess is quite fitting. And hopefully that kind of works all right with the song. So yeah, that's it for my spooky October content. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe, drop me a comment. Always appreciate all that. And if there are any songs you'd like me to take a look at, any artists you'd like me to try my hand at, or any genres you'd like me to have a go at, please do let me know down in the comments. Next week, I've got my first viewer requested What If video going up based on an artist and a genre suggested by viewers over on Facebook. So that should give you an idea of the kind of thing that you as the viewer have the power to achieve. So watch out for that. In the meantime, that's all from me this week. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.